All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you coming by today. I am pleased to present Inside the Writer's Room, a conversation with Gary Smith. A little background about Mr. Smith. He has worked much of his life examining the lives of others, looking at the human condition, writing stories unparalleled in magazine and mostly for Sports Illustrated through the years. 4-time Magazine of the Year award winner, which is unprecedented. He has been in the Best American Sports Writing Series a record 12 times, and he is a prominent magazine journalist. I'm pleased to present Gary Smith. Okay, we're going to start off with an easy question here. After hearing all the awards and accolades, what does that mean to you now that you've been doing this for 30 plus years?
It just nice. It basically became helpful with coming into news stories. People would, maybe go on the internet to check out who this guy was. It was trying to walk into their life and ask a zillion questions, and maybe it just gave a little more credibility, or just made it easier for each ensuing story for the person to maybe go along for the ride. So that's mostly what it, meant. And just a nice, satisfying personally as well. Nice to get the recognition, of course.
Speaking of credibility, I know over the years you have really been able to scratch the surface of people's lives, get deep down into their psyches and who they are. Why do people trust you?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it, some of it has to do, like I say, your track record. People seeing that there was, something that they some of the people would do some work and read the stories, so that gave them some trust that you were more interested in understanding than in judging. And so I think that's pretty critical. And then mostly, I think it just comes on from the one-on-one encounter. My subjects, people I've written about, getting a sense that I was more interested in understanding the roots of what created who they are. So then whatever the leaves manifest as, they hopefully, they would be seen in the light of those roots and that soil that they came from. And so most people, when they read things in kind of a context like that, they have a lot of rope. They'll give a lot of leeway, and so hopefully the people come to sense that it will be put in that context and treated with a real understanding that when they're kind of providing intimate details about who they are and what their lives, moments of their lives that they might otherwise want to keep guarded. So I think just they come to sense, hopefully, that through the course of our conversation that's how I'm approaching it, that therefore they can maybe give a little more than they would give in other journalism contexts.
The public is generally cynical of media. A 24-hour constant churn of media. How has that changed your job in terms of not only the narrative storytelling model, but also, and again, building that trust with the audience and also with the subjects of your stories?
Well, it became harder over the years to get that kind of time with somebody, so I really had to clear it up front. And we're as fortunate that I'm doing 4 stories a year where I could really dig in and spend time. And so I would, I'd make it clear what my goal was, what my intentions were, and really make sure the person that was signed on to take this ride with me. And if they weren't up front, I'd say, you can read other stuff I've done and point them that way. And if once they looked at it, if they weren't ready to go for it, we wouldn't go for it. But generally people were, but you're right. I mean, the access has gotten so whittled down. Most athletes just want to, give you 15, 20 minutes and be done with it. But what I was doing was different. So they pretty much had free chance to look at it and decide whether they wanted to do it. And if they didn't, then I wouldn't do it. So it was kind of like a mutual consenting situation. And I'd give them fair warning that I'm going to be hanging around for about a week and a half. working in and out of your schedule, and but it's going to take a number of hours, and then I'm going to be calling back after I've spent that face-to-face time and with follow-up questions. And so anyway, it's worked out, but it whittled the numbers of story possibilities. I ended up doing a lot more stories probably about unknown people because of that. Since people that are very famous often wanted to give less and less time because they're so inundated from so many sides by so much media that it probably half of my stories, especially over the last 15, 20 years, ended up being about unknown people who had great stories. So it just became, a realization more and more that you could go to people who no one knew, but that had incredible personal stories. And you could write as good, probably a better story about an unknown person than you could about a celebrity. And it would really resound, it would really strike home with readers. And, they'd be more moved often by those stories than by the celebrity stories. And most celebrity stories, you might be lucky to get an hour lunch with somebody, So if I was going to do a celebrity, they had to be agreeable to what, a much deeper commitment. Otherwise, I was going to be looking, off in the margins for stories.
Let's go back just a little bit. In 1975, you graduated from LaSalle. And then you went to work in Philadelphia for a while, and then you left and you went on this European adventure. You learned how to make bricks in Italy, you went to France. How did that change your life perspective and your storytelling perspective as you moved forward after you returned?
I think it just became more and more about human beings, less and less about who's hot in the sport and those kind of things. Having that kind of distance from it, just to me, it became more and more about the human being, and it also put me traveling like that, which I would highly recommend to anybody who's really interested in doing long form writing of any kind. It puts you in a lot of scenarios with a lot of different kind of people. Oftentimes, people you have no clue your language, and by putting yourself in those situations, I think it makes you a better reporter, a better interviewer, where you're just used to being thrown into with any kind of person. I mean, just hanging out, ending up spending nights in homes of total strangers, peasants who invited you in, all kind of scenarios like that. Just made it easier and easier to walk into people's lives back in America and on any socioeconomic level, and just be at ease and ask questions, and it just being much more open and free, and just throwing yourself out there. I think for me, it really helped build confidence and opening up to the world. And so from my experience, I would really, recommend that to anybody who really wants to go into writing, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, but especially anything with any length or depth to it. Just getting at ease with yourself and with all kind of human beings, where they're not picking up a sense of uneasiness, because when they pick that up, that's when it starts to compromise what you get from them, how much they're willing to open up. So really learning to kind of peel yourself open is a really important second track that goes along with the first track of developing yourself as a writer and your writing voice.
I read a great deal about how you approach stories, and oftentimes you talk about you conduct research, but you try not to develop assumptions and assertions and preconceived opinions of people going into those interviews. How do you avoid, after doing all your research, not putting together some opinions and some assumptions about the people you were going to spend a week or a week and a half or 2 weeks with?
Well, there's no doubt you pick up clues about personality traits by reading all the background material. But, I think I just found early on that people, once you get to know them and meet them where they're at and understand what they come from, there can be kind of a connection to these people and an open-heartedness to them that no matter what the stance they took in life, whether even sometimes it was a hard-shelled stance toward life, you start to understand that this is a coping technique that this person needed to develop to get through something. And so when you start to see it that way, and understand that that's how human beings work, then it just became, interesting in figuring out why is this shell, why is this presentation, why has this self been created, and so I'd kind of just go off on a voyage to figure out why that particular self got created, and the more you learn about it, those kind of things, the more your heart often goes out to people to understand why they had to create that self, why that coping strategy was adopted by somebody. So that's how it's worked for me.
In a society, a media society, we're looking for quick hits. We're looking for tweets that talk about people. You seem to take us far from the black and white and into the gray areas. Is that just an inherent responsibility that you feel when you walk into these stories to move us past just the black and white of individuals and certain situations?
Yeah, I mean, to me, when I first started on the writing trajectory, paradox kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop. It seemed like anything you could say, the opposite could also be true. But then the more and more, I started reading and learning about human beings and watching them and observing it, just more and more you came to realize that the deeper truth is that there's a mixture of things going on. It's not black and white. It's a whole mixture of things that is behind our decisions, who we become, how we choose to present ourselves to other people. And so, and rather than being that gray, that mixture, rather than being fearful of it and just reducing it to black and white, which happens in a lot of short form, quick hit journalism, that there was a much deeper, richer vein to mine by going right for that gray, that mixture, that paradox, that ambiguity. And so when people read that kind of stuff, it rings truer to them about their own soul, that it isn't just a black or white, this or that. There's a whole swarm of stuff going on, and the more you could kind of open yourself up to that as a writer and get that on a page, the more authentic it felt to people reading it. So that's kind of what drove me deeper and deeper in that direction, I think.
I understand your wife is a psychiatrist. Is that correct?
Yes. She was a sports writer when she started, by the way.
Ironically enough. And what is her role? Not only, I know she does some editing for you, but what else is her role when you're trying to work on stories and you're developing stories and thoughts and ideas? Where does she come into the process, or doesn't she?
She edits the piece after it's written, and she'll throw in a 2 cents here or there, and sometimes it's, that's been very helpful. She, her coming from a writing background, plus having a background in psychiatry. But I think, we were probably always attracted to each other because I was already into that stuff myself. I was, reading a lot about psychology and the human mind and philosophy. So it wasn't so much like I was leaning on her for that side. I was already kind of really pulled that stuff already. And so it's great to have somebody in-house who can read over your stuff and say, this doesn't quite work, or flesh out this a little bit, or you might have missed, you might have left a little blank here that needs to be filled in. And occasionally to throw in, a little bit of her, experience with certain types of human, archetypes, just personality traits and how they work out, or sometimes people who are in depressed and medication, things like that. That could be helpful for information for me to, with what kind of questions they ask about that side of it, the science and the medication side of it. But even more so, a lot of this stuff, was being developed by in a lot of ways, just my own fascination with that stuff, and reading a lot about it, and just, even with friends, when we're talking about those kind of things, those kind of human issues. So it's just I'm really intrigued by that stuff, and I think you kind of need to be if you're going to go into this into long form fiction or nonfiction, writing. If that's not an interest, then that pretty much is guiding you to tell you that there's probably a different aspect of communications or journalism that maybe you want to be heading down.
Who's the better psychiatrist, you or your wife?
She clearly is in session to help people get better. So there's no competition there, but it's really, interesting to throw this stuff around back and forth. But yeah, she's pretty darn good at it.
Well, and so are you to a certain degree. Certainly, we've discussed this before, but we've talked about the emotional baggage that you take on, because any journalist who becomes that immersed in a piece will give a part of himself or herself to create a better story. What do you do with that kind of emotional baggage when you're talking about real sensitive issues?
I think it's important to let yourself feel it. I think if you keep your walls up, then you're going to be treating your character with it's walking that fine line of being objective, but yet being open-hearted to the human condition and to another human being who maybe is suffering or has been suffering, and what it was like, and putting yourself in their shoes. Remembering what it was like when you were a teenager or in awkward phases of your life or moments, and treating it with that respect. So, yeah, I think it's important for you to keep your heart open to it, because if you don't, it's going to be very difficult to render it to readers in a way that's going to touch their heart. If you got your walls built up to these things, the reader's going to feel those walls. You're not going to be, if you're not feeling it, how can it go through your fingertips onto the page and into the reader's heart? It's all a connection. It's an energy. It's a kind of a transference of energy, and if that energy is blocked from the source, from my end of it, then it's not going to hit home on the other end. So I think it's important to keep that, but also within the tightrope walk is keeping objectivity and seeing how it plays out. For a human being to be that way, you really do ask a lot of questions. The pluses and minuses of the coping strategy. You want to really understand that human being and why they came to that stance with the world, but then how that plays out in the world. That's where you're asking a lot of questions to a lot of people around that person, and you really discover how that plays out and what are the pluses and minuses of a human being with that kind of a nature, and that's where the objective side comes in. And so you build from the inside out, so you get the person's subjective sense of his or her reality, and that's you're going to be in much more in an understanding, heartful mode there. But you're going to see how it plays out, and you're really going to weigh what are the trade-offs, what are the costs when you're that way, what do you gain and what do you lose, and so that's where you're really sweeping a wide net around a lot of people around that person and seeing how it plays in the world to be that kind of person. And that brings in the objective side and hopefully balances a piece enough so you don't just feel like you're getting an apology for somebody, who they are, or just a justification. You're getting both sides of that coin. Hopefully, that's the goal.
When we started planning this event, we were not, or at least I was not aware, today is the 10-year anniversary of the unfortunate death of Pat Tillman. 11 days after his death, and actually on the day of his very public remembrance, you wrote a story for Sports Illustrated. And at the end of that story, you weren't able to tie up exactly what happened. And you left a lot of options, because the military was still investigating. Originally, the American people were told that this was, enemy combatants had killed him in Afghanistan. Found out later that wasn't the case. What was it like for you the first time to write that story and not have a conclusion?
It's challenging. It's not fully satisfying. You just don't. There's dots and you're not able to connect dots, and so you do the best job you can with it, and that there's all kind of nuances and levels to this story that you're not getting to, and that was one where I was fortunate enough to have a chance to go back, down the road and really once there was more information and material to delve into there to have a real shot at developing that story.
And how much, the reporting for your second story, about 14 months later, incredible amount of reporting, talked to a number of people. Do you feel that story is finished now? I recently saw a 30 for 30 piece on ESPN talking with some of the gentlemen soldiers who were actually shooting at Tillman. Is there one more step to that, or is that something you can move on from and leave it where it's at and let the work stand?
There's definitely another piece. Now that these guys are finally, the guys who were on the shooting end of that are starting to, face it and come forward with it. So I don't think it's probably not a story that I'll be going back to, but it's definitely a story that's there to be done. And ESPN started that process. It was really great to see that young man gain the strength to come forward and talk about that. I mean, I just can't imagine walking around and trying to keep that all bottled up inside you. So it was really great to see that next step of it just happen just a couple days ago.
In the second Tillman piece, you led it by talking to Russ Bear and kind of his circumstances, his involvement, good friends of Pat Tillman's. He was with him, or he was there that day when it happened. What has happened to Russ? Do you follow the characters afterwards? Do you have any idea how he's doing these days?
No, I mean, in a number of stories you end up staying in contact, with the people. On that one, I did not, so I don't know what's become of Russ. But he played a huge role in that story because Pat's brother was with him when that happened. He was in the U.S. Army Rangers as well, but and his name was Kevin, and Kevin was not willing. He was still so in so much grief over what happened, and just didn't want to talk about it. And so Russell became kind of like the brother that in a way he was a brother in spirit of Pat's, and was being able to use his vantage point on what had happened was really big for that story. Finding your angle of a story is really a huge question on each story, and where you're going to kind of tell the story through, where you're going to set your camera up, or who you're going to filter it through, where your eyes are going to be kind of angling at your piece is a big part of all the decision making. It can really take a story that might be ordinary and really give it all kind of color and nuance and depth. So that's a interesting thing to think about. There's a story I did about Pat Summitt, who was a coach at Tennessee, and I was just going there to tell that story, and it was just going to be a typical, writer, third-person story. And then, I started hearing stories about this point guard that had played for her, Michelle Marciniak, and these two had a really intense relationship. The point guard for Pat Summitt was going to have to be an extension of her. And so, there was an example of, suddenly about halfway through the research on that, through the interviewing process, deciding, wow, this story, I bet if I could tell it through the eyes of this teenage girl who meets this woman and then spends these 4 incredibly intense years with her, that this story would be a different story than just told, from a distance, third-person Pat Summitt story. So, I just flew up to Pennsylvania where this point guard was living at this point. She was already graduated college, and just got her side of everything and just ended up telling the tale kind of through her eyes. So you're now seeing Pat Summitt through the eyes of this young, who was a teenager, now a young adult, and the story just gained all kind of charge to it just by making that switch. So that's an important piece of the whole thing.
Gary, who do you read? What writers do you follow? What interests you when you sit down to read a story?
I don't read a lot of magazine stuff at all. I'm really much more interested in reading philosophy and things that are kind of bent towards psychology and philosophy. So you probably haven't heard of a lot of this stuff, but I did go through a whole. When I was in college back then, I started with Steinbeck and then Hemingway, and went through the whole phases of. Then Hermann Hesse was a writer who was very deep into understanding the human mind, and then it kind of went off to Albert Camus and Nietzsche, a philosopher who's a great writer. So it just kind of went off in that path, which I found really helpful for understanding human beings and in the writing.
How have you, over the years, you've been doing this for a great period of time now, how have you evolved as a writer? What do you think is the bigger difference between what you're writing in 2014 compared to what you wrote in perhaps 1984?
In 1984, did you say?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it just got more layered, and a lot of it's how you develop as a person. That's a huge piece of it, as I alluded to before. And the more your story can only be as wide or as deep as you are, so you are the limits. So it's really important to make yourself, as wide, have as much depth and width as you can. And so I think that just all that just kind of hopefully kept growing and played out in the stories. So let me let my dog in. Hold on. We'd have been hearing some barking there all the way through for a while there, so it's better to cut it off to pass. So yeah, I don't know if I answered that question all the way or not, but
that's fine. Do you worry about, or how do you contend with the perception that you put people on the sofa and you cut them open and analyze them, at least their thought processes? How do you contend with that, and how much awareness do you need to have when you walk into a story or with a story subject to not just make it this peripheral examination?
Yeah, it really feels like my sense of those interviews is that it doesn't feel like this, harsh light coming on and, this interrogation beginning. It's really much more casual than that. And, there's obviously some more sensitive questions you're not going to start out asking right, when you first walk into the room with a person. You let your rapport build up over some time, and it just gradually gets deeper and deeper into is often some more intimate and sensitive stuff. But by that time, hopefully there's a trust, as we talked about before, and I also keep it open, like, if you're, don't try to hide from things, like saying, if you're uncomfortable with any questions I'm asking or uncomfortable about how, this will be rendered on a page, let's talk about it. Let's keep the process up on the table rather than under the table and trying to hide or run away from any discomfort about stuff. I think the more you're wide open with that stuff and make it clear that you're easy about talking about it, that you can build trust with that way, and just let the person know that don't hide your misgivings or worries about what we're doing here. Just let's talk about it whenever you feel like we're in dicey area here.
All right, Gary, how about if we open it up to the audience for questions? You all right for that?
Sure.
All right, anyone have a question?
Hi, I have a question on a specific story, the Crow basketball player story. You talked briefly about how you go in and tell the athletes that you're going to talk to them for more than just a few hours, but a common theme in this story was that they kind of even resented white people and the Crow Nation. How did you go beyond that to really gain their trust, because you got a lot of insight on their opinions, and how did you get past that barrier so they could trust you?
Well, on that story, a couple things were helpful. One was having just before that I went to that story, I'd spent a year living in Bolivia, which is more indigenous than any country in South America, less Hispanicized and more indigenous. So I'd been kind of hanging out with Native American people who live in Bolivia for a year before that. So that helped as far as just being used to that kind of nature in some ways. And then I read a lot about the American Indians and the Plains Indians up in the Northwest, and read about 5 books about it. So I really have a deeper understanding of their heritage and history. And then it was, again, just a lot. And once I met Jonathan Take's Enemy, it was just spending that time with him and, just seeing what his world was like. Going around and, on the reservation with him, just seeing what his days were like, what the people he hung out with, what they did for fun, just drinking it all in and asking a lot of questions. But then it was also a matter with him, since he is shy, as many Native Americans are, and realizing that I would have to ask the same question over, and I'd have to paraphrase it maybe 3 or 4 times to get the true answer. He might just kind of give a couple word answer that was very superficial at first time I asked a question. So I just have to kind of just keep a kind and gentle approach to it all, but just not be afraid to come back and rephrase that same question again and again. And it was often, like I said, the 3rd or 4th time I'd ask a question. And that's true of all people, not just Native Americans. I think it's really important. I found that with many interviews that people are prone to give pretty pat answers the first time you ask them about things. They just say what's, something that just kind of takes care of answering it without really answering it, maybe the way they really might feel. So it's coming back to the same question, not being afraid to ask it again. Sometimes you can bounce it, if you think it's something that might be important, you bounce it off people around them and you get their take on it. And then you come back to the person and say, well, your brother Tom says, or your friend Sam said, whatever, just talked about how this was part of your life. And you just kind of just bend the question a little bit, maybe strain the question through someone else. And then you'd find the person opening up and talking in a way that gave you way more details and heart to their response than the kind of the mind answer, the answer from their cerebrum that they gave you right off the top, just to kind of take care of it and dust it off. So anyway, those were a couple of things that I think that were helpful in making that story work.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, but with regards to the Kayla Harris and R.A. Dickey story, how did you prepare yourself, especially mentally, to start working on a story of that magnitude?
I read everything I could about both of them, and then, it wasn't so much like then that I had to prepare myself mentally. I'd gone into a number of stories where I've talked with people about intimate things. So it wasn't like, oh, I've got to put on this different persona or approach or anything with them. It was, again, just being human and understanding we're all can be caught in these scenarios in life. There's, and again, it was just kind of just being yourself and not rushing into things, but again, not tiptoeing around them when it came time, appropriate time to ask about details about how things happened. And they both had an understanding that many other young people and people of all ages, but most painfully of all, young people were going through these things, and they wanted to get it out, even though it was very difficult, painful going through reliving those moments. But they understood the objective and sensed that I was working toward that same objective to help other people who've been through this. And so they were willing to go there. And, a lot of times reporters take themselves out of things. Their own uneasiness about a subject makes them pull away or call off the horses in a way too early. As writers, our fear of stepping on toes your own uneasiness of the subject can limit you so much, rather than if you're open to it and have the right spirit about it, trusting that the other person in this dance in a way gets that, and not limiting your questions because you're afraid of making someone else uneasy or you're uneasy about it. So there's a lot of, I've kind of seen that happen in many scenarios where reporters pull back or don't, I'm not talking about an attack kind of question, but in a very heartful way, sympathetic way, empathetic way, asking about things that are very difficult. That's where, again, some of that life experience really helps, getting as much of it as you can, and so you're at ease with human beings in all kind of scenarios, so that you're willing to, you're not afraid to go to ask those questions, and not giving off a vibe to them of discomfort, because they're going to pick that discomfort up, and that's going to close them down. So, but I'm not going to take myself out of the possibilities of this story by me self-editing all these questions and saying, I can't do that. That might make them uneasy. It's trusting that there's a relationship there, and then really going for the material. Those details are what make a story like that work, and I'll explain that to the person. That these details, I know they're painful to relive and revisit, but it's in the details of the story, the rendering of the story, that it comes to life and has any power that it's going to have. So to go through a story like this and not get those kind of really delicate details, then we might as well not even do the story, because it's going to just be like a service piece. It just gives information about sexual abuse. If we don't go through the ride with these people of what it really is like to go through that, and all the psychological ripples that come in its wake, if we don't get down and dirty about those details, then the readers aren't going to feel it, and people are not going to change on this subject. There's not going to be a change in what happens in this country or in the world around this subject if people don't really understand bit by little bit what it's like to go through this.
Other questions? No other questions?
Earlier you had mentioned how your intensive humanistic approach to these interviews kind of shies away some of the bigger subjects, and you have to find stories with lesser known people. But how do you decide what's going to make a good story, and how do you find that focus of the story?
Yeah. First of all, about half the stories I've written about the idea probably came from the magazine, from editors there, and half were my ideas. So it's kind of, would have to be mutually agreeable between both of us, my idea for them or their idea for me. But I was drawn to ideas that felt like they had some legs to them that could really, you really got to think about that. Is this a story that can last 7,000 words? Is there ripples to it? Is there twists and turns to it? Is there depth to it? So yeah, it's hard to kind of define in a couple sentences how you know what that is, but it's just something you start to sense. Just one example of that was we were living in Sydney, Australia, the year before the Olympics in Sydney, and somebody came over from America with a USA Today, and there was a one paragraph mention in there about a African American coach in this little Mennonite Amish town in Ohio who was taking the team to a state championship and had brain cancer now and wasn't talking to anybody about it, but he was dying of brain cancer. And so I just kind of cut that out, and we had about another 5 months to live there in Sydney till the year was over. But as soon as I got home, I called that high school, and he had just died. And so the principal said, yeah, you can come out. He just died about 2 weeks ago. But it would just struck me that, here's an African-American coach in this Amish Mennonite town. There's got to be all kind of stuff, cultural stuff there. It just suggested a lot. So it's just having a sense that, of situations. Another one was about a U.S. Olympic walker, a guy who was trying to make the U.S. Olympic team as a walker, and he committed suicide because he just by a little bit missed making the U.S. Olympic team. He was the fourth best walker in America, not the third best walker. He had the top three make it to the Olympics, and he committed suicide. And there's something about that just struck me, like, you think of sports that have intensity, and a walker, it doesn't seem like the sport where a guy is going to commit suicide because he fails. And so that incongruity just struck me as there's something there about that would be really interesting to explore. So it's just little things like that you have strike a bell somewhere inside of you that there's something that would be really interesting to explore. And I think that's knowing yourself as a person and as a writer, and knowing what interests you really is what matters hugely in all this. Because when I'd go off on a story, it'd be like I'd be approaching it like I'm going off to write a short story, not a piece of journalism. So it'd be like I'm going to go learn everything I can in order to write a short story that really brings people in, and make them feel like they're reading almost the way you'd feel like reading a piece of fiction, a short story, not at journalism. It's just going to hit X, Y, these four bases, this information that needs to be hit. Me knowing what would intrigue me about human beings, that just knowing what interests me, that's going to pull me towards stories that have those elements, and that's going to allow me. It's going to just create a situation where I'm writing about what I care about, what fascinates me, and that's going to be much easier for me to hopefully intrigue a reader if it's something I really care about and I'm fascinated by. So it's knowing yourself. I mean, you could be a person that's really much more fascinated about environmental issues, and your heart is going to go into that, and those pieces are going to resonate with that more. So it's knowing yourself enough to know what really intrigues you, and then looking for pieces that hit those chimes inside of you, and then you're much likelier to strike them in readers, rather than just saying, what am I supposed to do in this story? What do I think the editor wants from this story? I mean, when you're approaching stuff from that way, I think you're already lost almost. It's not about trying to satisfy somebody else in a lot of ways. It's so much about what captivates you, and exploring that.
Any other questions?
Through your questioning, how can you, or what is the best way to find the roots of somebody? Because obviously you don't want to just start off and be like, well, tell me your life story.
Yeah, well, first is, reading everything you can about that person, and if there's not that much out there about the person, it's learning everything you can about the world that they're in. And so then you start, I would start thinking of some questions, just some baseline questions, and I would write down those questions and have some idea of where I'd want to, start. And then, then I'm also, at the same time, I'm interviewing all the people around them, and so new things are coming up, and so little things that I'm learning from them, I'm just now adding to the questions that I'm going to come back to the main person with. And so it just kind of builds organically. You don't say, tell me your life story. You start out with specifics. What was it like to be, 5 years old with the parents that were, at each other's throats, arguing all the time? Or what was it like to lay in your bed at night when you'd hear that going on? Get them in specific situations. Take them through you're almost picturing yourself in that situation yourself, so that you're using your own imagination to start to sense what situations a human being's in, and then crafting questions that go to that. That's just a few of the ways. And again, you're interviewing all people around them, and you're getting more stuff that should be setting off a lot of, more questions in your mind. And then again, when you get home after all the face-to-face interviewing, you're going through all that material again. And, at that point, I'd be typing that into my laptop under different categories, thematic or chronological categories. A whole slew of new questions would be coming up, and I'd be starting to hone in on what I really wanted to make this story about, what the heart of it really was for me. And once you start to realize that really starts to spawn a lot of questions, new questions, and how am I going to make this work? Now that I have a sense of where this piece is going, how am I best going to make it work? Here's a scene that I had a little bit about, but now that I see where the story's going, that scene is now going to be a critical scene. So I need to know more about that scene. I need to be able to write it like I was there. So I'm going to, anybody who might have been there, I'm going to talk to them, call them back on the phone, and ask them questions, and get every little detail again to write it as if I was right there. So that's just pieces of the whole thing, how it comes together where the questions just grow and grow and grow as you're going through the process.
The story ideas that you come up with, just about the unknown human beings, the ones that the public don't know about, like, what's the best way to discover those unknown stories? Is it just from scouring newspapers and looking for like small little blurbs like that basketball coach? Is it relying on tips from other people, or is it just using the power of observation? And if it's that, how do you know what to observe, I guess, to find those stories?
Partly, by reading, newspapers, reading a couple papers. That was a big piece of it. Sometimes it was a tip from somebody else. Sometimes somebody would write in with a story. I've had a couple times where people wrote to me and said, "I read this story you did. I think you'd be a good person to write this." And they just give me just enough details in the letter that really struck me that I would get back with them, and got a couple really, rewarding stories that way. So it's just keeping your antenna up. When you're talking to people, there was a story I did about Little Rock High School where the integration occurred back in 1957, and how that the football team was the best team in the country, and then they had to, the school was closed, and they kept trying to play with no school there, but the football team kept playing. That's how important high school football was in the South. Still is probably, but back in the 50s. But that was something I was just interviewing somebody from another for a whole different story, and he said it just came up in their story that they were at Little Rock Central High School in 1957 when the National Guard was there blockading keeping black students out, and so that it just like in the back of my mind, like, wow. What must that have been like to be high school football players, a big high school like that, where suddenly it's a war zone at your high school. So that just stuck in the back of my mind, so I went back to Little Rock afterwards and followed that trail. So just little things like that, just keeping your antenna out, reading and talking to people, and, just when something rings that bell, like, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to be in that situation? I wonder how that was, what that was like. And that just would kind of set me off down another trail.
All right, Gary, two quick things. What's your dog's name?
Radio.
Does that have anything to do with any of your stories you've written?
One of them that you might know about, yeah, he was black and impulsive, this dog, so it was clearly, it had to be Radio.
All right, that's great. If you have a chance to read that story, please do, or if you've seen the movie, fantastic. And would you be willing to share with us what you're working on right now?
I'm basically working not on a sports story right now. I'm working on a book project of my own at this point. So anyway, it's been fun.
And when can we expect that to be out?
Maybe about 2 years, something like that. I guess that's a rough guess.
All right, we'll look forward to that. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Smith. Thank you so much, Gary, for being with us.